So the next book is The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. This is a memoir by Jean-Dominique Bauby, and you'll have to forgive me, I have no idea how to pronounce his last name, or even if I pronounced his first name correctly. My French, as I have said repeatedly, is abysmal. Uh, this this is a memoir that Jean-Dominique wrote. He was I'm not exactly sure, he was very high up. What was he? He was the editor of Elle magazine in France. I know I'm reading the back cover, but uh, I couldn't remember the name of the magazine there. But he was the editor of Elle magazine in France, and he had a massive stroke, and it left him locked in a locked-in state. So unlike if he had fallen and broken his spine or something like that, uh, instead of being completely numb and paralyzed, he was paralyzed, but he could feel everything. And at first, all he could do was blink his eyes. He could kind of move his head side to side, and he could move his finger a little, but he couldn't speak. And this is a memoir that he wrote by, so they set up a board with letters on it, from the most used letters in French to the least used, and the person would run their finger along from letter to letter, and when they got to the right letter, he would blink, and that is how this memoir was written, and it was the only way that he could communicate also. And by the end of this, he is starting to be able to speak a little bit, but he did die 2 days after this book was published. So um, it it details all the things that he experienced after his stroke, during his stroke, before his stroke. It talks about his childhood, about his marriage, his children, his father, his parents, what it was like to live in this rarefied culture of this fashion magazine with all these really brilliant intellectuals, and they're kind of snobs, and he admits that he's a little bit of a snob too, and he talks about everything that he has lost, and how in this time all he has really are his mental faculties. His mind has not been damaged at all, but his body has become a prison cell, basically. And I think I expected something quite different from this. I bet that this is very, very eloquent in French. From what I understand, he was also a writer, and I'm not sure if he wrote novels or nonfiction. I'm pretty sure he wrote at least one novel, but I'm not sure. I didn't look up to see what other books he had written. But he talks about, how unexpected this was and how awful this was, and also how he is able to use his thoughts and to travel places and to imagine things and to escape into his thoughts. And I don't know, I'm going to be honest, I think this is a book that I would really have to reread. Um, it was not what I expected, and that's, I think, probably a good thing. I felt that, I hate to say that it was a little bit thin, but it was a little bit thin. And I really think I would benefit from rereading this book, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. I, I thought that it was interesting. It was interesting, and it was sad, and it's not a depressing book. He tries to see the bright side of things. He tries to, um, he hopes that things will get better for him. He hopes that he will be able to accept this and maybe have some semblance of a life beyond this hospital. A part that really resonated with me was his friend comes to visit him, and they put him in his wheelchair and wheel him down beside the beach, downwind from like a snack bar, and he sits there and he just soaks up the scent of cooking French fries. And I think maybe, scent is a very powerful sense, and it conjures up memories. And I mean, I know exactly what that smell is. And I don't know. That hit me kind of hard, actually, thinking about how such a small thing could mean so much to someone, and how lucky we are to be able to walk around and move and talk, and even when we have pains and when we have unpleasant days, and there is always someone who wishes more than anything that they could do what we do. And so this is a valuable book. It's a rarefied book. It's written by a man who was in such a state that it would have been far easier for him not to have written this book. And like I said, I would really like to reread that. So the next book is Enemy at the Gates by William Craig, The Battle for Stalingrad. And despite the movie cover there, this book is not a novelization of Enemy at the Gates. It is not a novel that spawned Enemy at the Gates. It is not a history or a memoir or a biography, rather, of Vasily Zaitsev. He's in the book, but only for about 10 pages. This is a history of the Battle of Stalingrad. And so Stalingrad, it's now called Volgograd. It's on the Volga River. And there is a vast steppe land. It's kind of like the Great Plains here in the U.S., kind of. And it goes all the way from Mongolia clear into what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so all the way into Eastern Europe. And there's a city called Stalingrad. And the Germans race across this land. They cross the Don River, and between the Don and the Volga is, I think at this point, is something like 40 miles. And they besiege Stalingrad. They lay waste to it. And the Russians have to come in and across the Volga River. And let's see, I can't remember exactly how this worked. I'm not really particularly good with strategy, but the Russians managed to come down and cut off General Pallas's army and surround them entirely and keep these German armies stuck in this region around Stalingrad. And they were able to cut off all the supplies coming from, I think, 1,000 miles away, something like that. I've done a lot of reading about the Second World War. I've watched a lot of documentaries, a lot of TV documentaries over my life, starting when I was very, very young. And what really amazes me about the Second World War now is not the fighting. It's not the combat or I mean, it's all very interesting, but what absolutely amazes me are these supply lines, these 1,000-mile, 2,000, 3,000 mile supply lines of, in the Germans' case, for instance, most people don't realize this because of how, the legend of the Blitzkrieg, the mechanized Blitzkrieg has really grown up over the past 80 years. But the German army was mostly a horse-drawn army. They were mostly based around horses. Not carriages, but wagons drawn by horses carrying all these supplies 1,000 miles. That's wild, but it is true. And in fact, there would be thousands and thousands of horses, German horses in Stalingrad, and horses that they had, stolen from the people they had killed along the way. And, there is some terrible, awful violence recounted in this, seen from firsthand, and not just soldier on soldier, but what the Germans did to people. Some of it is so incredibly violent I can't even say it here, YouTube would not like it. Um, some of it was sickening, to be honest with you. Sick. I mean, like I have a pretty strong stomach. I've read a lot of stuff, but uh, the Russian army was able to surround General Pallas's army and to cut off their supply lines, and it just became this siege in the city, this endless hellish fight between these two armies who despised each other, absolutely hated each other. Uh, and the German supplies were running out, and they got weaker and weaker. Some of them were starving to death, standing up, just dropping dead. And we see this from the people who were around Hitler, talking to him, and who were saying, we have to get the army out of this place. This is terrible. We're going to lose Paulus. We're going to lose the army. This is not a hill. This is going to ruin us. And Hitler was, I mean, luckily for the whole world, he was so full of himself that he thought, when Paulus can do it, Goering can supply them from the air. I'm sure he was probably on all those amphetamines by this point. And so it becomes this, I think, it starts in the summer, it ends in, I think, February or maybe January. And it's rough. I wasn't totally impressed by this book for the first 200 or so pages, but it really, really, really picks up towards the end. I think just because William Craig had to set it up, and then he could really get down into the guts of this thing. And he talked to hundreds and hundreds of people who were there. And I was impressed by this towards the end. I didn't care for the beginning. And eventually the Russians were able to defeat the Germans. The Germans had to surrender. I mean, it's rough. It is a violent book about a violent time and a violent, very, very violent setting. And I probably have not done a particularly good job explaining it, but there was a lot going on. And Stalin, at the same time, Stalin didn't want Stalingrad to be taken for multiple reasons. One, because he thought that they could destroy the German Sixth Army. He thought that the Nazis had overreached themselves, but there was also Stalingrad, right? So it was sort of a personal thing. You can't take my city. This is my city. You can't have it. And it does talk about, say, the purges that had taken place in the Russian army, all that sort of thing. So there's a whole lot going on in this book that I really can't explain. But I thought that I might read a page or two here and give you an idea. So this is in September. This is a month or so after this battle starts. Alexei Petrov came across the Volga and was assigned to the northern sector near Latoshenka. For 10 days, he had been given hurried instructions in the use of a 122-millimeter cannon, but with time running out, the exasperated instructor finally told him to teach himself. As best he could, Petrov mastered the techniques of firing the heavy weapon that had a range of nearly 6 miles. The squat, wavy-haired sergeant had spent months as a construction worker in Kuyabyshev before being drafted. There he unexpectedly met his brother, who told him the rest of his family, his mother, father, and sister, had been swallowed up in the Ukraine by the German advance. They had not been heard from in more than a year. When ordered into Stalingrad, Petrov went to the dock and saw that the other shore of the Volga was a solid wall of flames. Though scared to death, he knew he would go across. But other Russians would not, and Petrov watched as NKVD guards fired in the air over the deserters, and then killed them when they ran from the landing. After Alexei climbed on board the barge, the NKVD took no further chances. Guards lined the rails to prevent anyone from jumping overboard. Bombers came over, seeking out the steamers and tugs. German mortars behind Mamayev reached out for them, and Petrov cursed the slowness of the voyage as the river froze in a midday tableau. Feeling trapped and vulnerable, he crouched down to hide from shrapnel singing by his ears. Men slipped off the sides to drown. Bullets thudded into flesh, and soldiers sagged against neighbors and died without a word. Petrov saw the Volga water clearly. It was a swirling mixture of water and bright red blood. His boat took nearly 2 hours to reach a landing site under the cliff. While the dead covered the deck, the living scrambled off. Nearly half of Petrov's regiment had died crossing the river. Because most of his unit was already dead, he now had to fight as an infantryman. His baptism to war was brutal. 3 scouts went ahead to gauge German strength. 2 came back. Petrov picked up his field glasses and scanned no man's land for the missing man. He was out there, spread-eagled on the ground. The Germans had thrust a bayoneted rifle into his stomach and left him face up in the open. Petrov and his squad went berserk. Screaming hoarsely, they jumped from their holes and ran forward. Bursting into a line of houses, they killed anyone who rose before them. When several Germans raised their hands in surrender, Petrov squeezed the trigger of his Tommy gun and killed them all. He came to an elderly Russian soldier, bending over a woman. Her jet-black hair streaming back in a carefully arranged way, she seemed to be sleeping. The man was moaning softly, dear girl, why should a young person like you have to die in such a war?" Alexei Petrov stood beside the couple and cried bitterly as he looked down at the beautiful woman. Then he ran off to kill her tormentors. In the hallway of a house, he listened to a German wailing in one of the downstairs rooms. The soldier prayed, "Oh God, let me live after this war." Petrov rammed the door open and saw a kneeling man who looked at him pleadingly. Petrov fired into his face. Wild-eyed, he went from floor to floor, smashing open doors, looking for gray-green uniforms. The pounding brought Germans out of different rooms. Petrov shot 3 more as they ran down the stairs. Exhausted, his anger eased. The house became very still. He stepped over the bodies on the stairway and went out the front door to find his own men. So that is his first day. That is his first day crossing the Volga into Stalingrad. Like I said, the violence in this book is extreme at moments. Against civilians. I mean, it's a rough book. It is a rough. I don't really know what else I can say, and I know. So this book was written in 1974, or it was published in 1973. I don't really know what else I can say about it. It had a slow start, but once it took off, it really took off, and it was searing, and it was unpleasant. It was written well, but it was not a pleasant subject. So after that, I read Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. So Joan Didion was a journalist, a novelist. I believe she died a couple of years ago. And she's there on the back cover with her husband and her daughter. And this is a book it is a memoir of the year after her husband died. And they were extremely close. They were both writers. They had spent pretty much every day together for 40 some odd years. They worked together, they were both writers, so they both worked at home, and so they were together every day, basically, except for, a day or two here and there. This starts off with her grief, her shock, and the Year of Magical Thinking is a reference to how she would say, leave her husband's shoes out because he would need them, or she couldn't get rid of his clothes because she kept expecting him to come home she would go places and come home and start to tell him something, and he was not there anymore. Uh, things like that, and just with this idea basically that he was going to be there when she came home, or that he was going to be there when she woke up, and sometimes she would forget, and she would wake up and wonder where he was, and then she would remember where he was. Um, and at the same time, their daughter had, so she had been in the ICU in a coma for 5 days, and her husband died after they had come home from the hospital to see their daughter. And he died. She was in the kitchen. They were having a conversation. He stopped replying to her, and when she went into the room, he was slumped over on the floor, or I think he had slumped over onto a table, and when she went over to him, he fell onto the floor. And this is extremely, Joan Didion was a fantastic writer. I mean, very, very clear prose. She knew exactly what she was trying to say, and she was able to marshal her words as she wanted them. She lived a very different life from most people. As you may imagine, she was a journalist, a writer. She had a lot of friends in high places, very intellectual friends. She was very intellectual herself. Her husband was also. A lot of house parties, a lot of traveling places by jet. She talks about how sometimes they would do ridiculous things when they were together, like they once bought a house. They put down $50,000 for this house in the early 80s or late 70s, and they could not sell the house they were already living in. And so while they are thinking, what's going to happen? Are we going to lose this $50,000? They just go, well, why don't we fly to Hawaii and rent a house on the beach? Just kind of weird stuff like that. They're having these money problems, but they never seem to actually have money problems because they are flying all over the world and going on these vacations and renting houses in Hawaii and that sort of thing. So that's a little odd to a reader, I think. Maybe that was even a little bit odd to Joan Didion. And so, in the wake of her husband's death, dealing with this massive grief, this loss of her best friend, her daughter is also in this coma for several months. And when she wakes up, she's still in very, very bad shape. And her husband died, I think, on December 30th. And her daughter didn't come out of this coma and become, fully functioning until March or April. And her daughter would continue to have these serious medical problems throughout this year. And I actually just learned yesterday, I read an article, just randomly read an article about Joan Didion. Her daughter actually wound up dying a year after this, or 2 years after this. I think it was 2 years after her husband died. But she would continue to be in these serious have these serious medical issues throughout. So she would go to California in the course of this year and collapse there and wind up in the hospital in California. And, like I said, the money parts of this book are kind of odd because they had just had this conversation. Her husband, Joan Didion, and her husband had just had this conversation about, well, do we have the money to go to Paris on vacation? And then they jet off to Paris for several weeks. And then somehow, like I said, the money is kind of an odd issue, and it's not really important, but it is kind of strange because, I guess I'm sure there was insurance. That's probably what it was, but Joan Didion never talks about that. She never talks about, say, their love life or anything like that either. She's very open about a lot of things, but she's also very silent on other things. If she didn't want to talk about something in a book, she just completely left it out. She wouldn't even make a reference to it, and you might not realize that she hadn't talked about it until afterwards. So she's one of those writers. I've read her book Slouching Toward Bethlehem. It's a collection of essays, articles that she had written. really, really very good, and I would really love to read all the nonfiction that Joan Didion wrote. I don't really have any interest in reading her novels because when I've looked at them, they just don't seem like my kind of thing. But I'd love to read all her nonfiction. I was really glad to read this. It's very sad. It's a very sad book.